Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here for a lecture by Professor Michael Brown. We have welcomed a number of the Canadian Jewish community in Israel who have come specially for a subject close to their heart, as they do not belong to the regular members of these closed lectures. I want to explain briefly the procedure. First the lecture, and then and only then we take questions. If I don't know your name, please say your name so that we can put you on the list of questions. You have seen in the newspapers, those of you who have read Idiot Achronot yesterday. Doesn't work? Those of you who have read Idiot Achronot yesterday could see it on the first page. The others who read other papers more on the inside, that we are involved together with ambassadors Mayor Rosein and Ambassador Eitan Betzur and Member of Parliament, ex-Minister Dani Nave, by studying the possibility of bringing a complaint to the International Criminal Court against President Ahmadinejad of Iran. We are working on this, and you will all hear from us more in the near future, I hope. Secondly, we usually at the beginning of these lectures give a brief review of new developments in anti-Semitism, which is the main subject in our program on the Jewish people. And unfortunately, since our last lecture, which isn't that long ago, there have been a number of worrying developments. The first one, of course, is the boycott campaign among British academics. We are in touch with one of the people who fights that. I think these kind of actions ultimately will lead to a major revision of the academic world, which anyhow is due for a major revision, because like the internet, hate is being propagated there under freedom. It's unfortunate that we, the Jews, have to be the people who will have to move that, but there is no doubt that the academic world, its rules of academic freedom, the kind of pretensions of doing academic work which is in essence to a large extent extended op-eds, as we have seen in the Walt Marsheimer case at Harvard, where the university had to, in fact, withdrew its support of as an academy of the paper which was produced there, and this will certainly go on. Also, very unpleasant developments at the University of California, Irvine, on which we will publish in the not too long future. The second development of importance, of course, is that the World Council of Churches' condemnation of Israel, blaming Israel for everything which is wrong in the Middle East, shows that Christian anti-Semitism is reviving at a frightening speed today, not so much in Catholic circles, but to a substantial extent in the Protestant world. I mean, the old ideas promoted by Luther, on which Hitler based himself, are also gaining support. Now to the last remark I want to make is those of our guests today who are not on our regular list. We have occasionally during the year open congresses. If you want to be invited for those, here is Rachel Neumann, herself a Canadian intern. You can register with her. So now it's my pleasure to invite Professor Michael Brown on From a Multicultural to an Open Society in Canada. Is it good for the Jews? Obviously this whole idea of multicultural society plays very heavily nowadays. There's a big congress at Hebrew University from the 12th to the 15th of June on how multicultural societies have affected Jews. And we will hear Michael on that. Professor Brown is a visiting professor of Canadian Studies at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry and the Halbert Center for Canadian Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Professor Emeritus at York University in Toronto. Of course, he is a fellow, a long-standing fellow of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs.
That's the important
one. You said it, Mike.
Well, I sort of suspect from the little introduction that Manfred gave, or his words before the introduction, that we can probably assume that nothing is good for the Jews. And I may attempt to prove that that's the case too, but anyhow. Multiculturalism and diversity are having a bad time of it these days, especially in conservative circles. A recent column in the Toronto Globe and Mail by Margaret Wente is illustrative. And I should say that Wente is a columnist I usually like to read because she is invariably sensible and humane. She's conservative, but not blindly, and she is lacking the disregard for the disadvantaged that is often exhibited by so many conservatives, and especially the neocons. And she's comfortable with Jews and understands our issues. So Wente opens her column, which she titled End of the Multicultural Myth, with a description of a family that she happened upon at an airport. A father and two children, quote, dressed in Western clothes, and a mother, again, quote, shrouded all in black from head to foot, with a narrow slit for her eyes, even her hands covered with black gloves. Wente goes on to register her readiness to live with difference, with, as she puts it, multiculturalism up to a point. But she also registers her unwillingness to accept immigrants to the West who reject Western values, including the equality of women. The column speaks positively of new Dutch citizenship regulations requiring immigrants to learn Dutch and to be tolerant towards Dutch mores. Joel probably could say more about this than I can, but anyhow, Dutch mores not only regarding women's rights, but even regarding more contentious issues such as gay marriage. Wente speaks kindly of the Dutch for banning the burqa, and of the city of Rotterdam for a new bylaw requiring that only Dutch be spoken in public. As an aside, I'd say the Rotterdam bylaw makes Quebec's Language Bill 101 look positively wishy-washy. Wente is, of course, selective, or her renunciation of diversity is selective. Gay marriage is okay, but the burqa is not. But as I said, she is a selective and thoughtful conservative with her own values. Actually, before it became a dirty word, she might have been called a liberal. Wente's discontents are just one rather mild indication of the growing public reaction against multiculturalism in many countries, including Israel and Canada. What lies behind the outcry is, to a certain extent, the politically very incorrect fear of the other, especially Islam, but not only. Islam is a relatively unknown quantity in Europe and America, and in general, people who walk around hiding their faces, whether in burqas or balaclavas, arouse unease. And unease has turned to fear and hostility with the incidents of recent years, the murder of Theo van Gogh and politician Pim Fortuyn in Holland for their criticism of militant Islam, the riots in Paris and other French cities this spring, the underground bombings in London and the train bombings in Madrid, to say nothing of 9/11 and the capers of Osama bin Laden. And there is a demographic threat in Europe as well as in Israel. But these are not my focus this morning. What is my focus is the shifting political and social framework in Canada away from multiculturalism and the probable impact of that shift on Jews there. To talk about that phenomenon, I need to back up and do a once-over-lightly history survey. And anyway, I'm a historian, and I'm much more reliable when I speak about the past than I am when speaking about the present or the future.
What a surprise.
No surprise at all. So let me begin by suggesting a threefold division of Canadian history, one period of which is or is not in its beginning stages. First, there was the binational period, which stretched essentially from the British conquest in the mid-18th century to the 1960s, and which, for the Jewish community, meant life on the margins and in between the cracks. Then came the short period of multiculturalism, a period of full belonging for the Jewish group, which began in the 1960s and is still with us, although I think waning. And finally, as it looks now, there is the dawning era of the open society, in which groups count for little and in which everything is up for grabs and may the best person win. Well, let's start with the first. From the British conquest in the mid-18th century until well after World War II, Canada was a binational, bi-religious, bicultural, bilingual country. As Gilbert and Sullivan put it, it was greatly to the credit of Anglo-Canadians that they were almost all of UK origin, English-speaking, tied culturally and politically to England, and Protestant by religion, except for Irish Catholics. French Canadians were culturally French and Francophone, had family roots in France, and were universally Roman Catholic. Those unfortunate enough not to come from either Britain or France were, in the parlance of Canadian immigration guidelines, non-preferred. People of color, people who ate garlic, like Slavs and Italians, and those who were neither Protestant nor Catholic, like Jews, were more non-preferred than others. The dual nature of the country was enshrined in the quasi-constitution, what we would call here in Israel Chok HaYesod, the British North America Act of 1867. Now, English Canada was more diverse than French Canada in these years, but it was at the same time a very demanding melting pot. People who came from places other than the British Isles were expected to adopt British culture and the English language. Outsiders, those who came from the European continent, and even Jews from Britain, felt considerable pressure to assimilate and to conform. Clarence de Sola provides an instructive example. His family had lived in Britain more or less since the readmission of Jews under Cromwell. His father, Abraham de Sola, was Canada's first ordained rabbi, which I put in quotation marks because he was really a chacham, he was a Sephardi. He was also a McGill professor and the first Jew in the empire to be awarded an honorary doctorate. Clarence himself had made and married into enough money to take his place in the Westmount Sun among the plutocrats of Anglo-Montreal. But religious prejudice, assimilationist pressure, and his own insecurities left him aware of his incomplete Anglo identity. To fix the flaw, he invented for himself and all the other Jews of Canada an inflated and largely false British Sephardi background, like that of his father, but not his mother, and not even Canada's founding Jewish family, the Harts. De Sola also became a staunch Zionist. He was the first president of the Federated Zionist Societies of Canada. Herzl thought he was a pompous ass, but that's another story. Now, this kind of involvement in Zionism was almost unthinkable in most other countries, especially in the U.S., for a man of de Sola's wealth and position. Zionism, with its sights on the land of Israel, was almost always the doctrine of people who felt themselves to be outsiders. But in fact, in binational Canada, Jews didn't really fit in at all. Until well after the turn of the 20th century, they were merely a very small and relatively inconspicuous appendage of Anglo-Canada. Their position in the educational system is indicative. Schools in Ontario and Quebec, the two most populous provinces before World War I and beyond, were either Protestant or Catholic. For a time at the beginning of the 20th century, Jews in Quebec were actually deemed legally Protestant for school purposes. Otherwise, they would have had no right to public schooling at all. Jews in Quebec could not vote in school board elections until well after World War II, much less stand for office. In Ontario, the Protestant schools became public after the First World War, and in Toronto neighborhoods with a Jewish majority, Jews could and did stand for school director in the early decades of the 20th century. Ida Siegel was one who did so successfully. But very few Jews were hired as teachers in Toronto or elsewhere until decades later, and the Protestant tone of the educational system obtained for many decades. By the turn of the 20th century, as their number in Canada grew, Jews were acknowledging in many ways their outsider status in the country, their existence as a third solitude, we might say, adopting Hugh McLennan's imagery. One way of admitting outsiders was turning to Zionism, like Clarence de Sola. In the pre-World War I years, Canada was one of 3 countries in the world with the highest per capita membership in the Zionist movement. What do you think the other 2 were? Any guesses?
South Africa.
This is a chance for my interactive portion.
South Africa, probably, no?
Pardon?
South Africa.
South Africa for sure. What's the third?
Australia.
No.
Poland.
No.
Russia.
Belgium.
Belgium?
Now, what do Canada, South Africa, and Belgium have in common?
Jews don't fit in.
Pardon? But what's the common feature?
Binational.
They're all binational states, that's right. And in every one of them, during the frequent periods of strife between the 2 official nationalities, when each group revved up its nationalist energies, its nationalist engines, Jews got squeezed. They were neither French nor English in Canada, neither French nor Flemish in Belgium, neither Afrikaners nor English in South Africa. In 1884, Yosef Eliyahu Bernstein, an erstwhile correspondent for the Eastern European Hebrew language newspaper Hamelitz, reported from Montreal that the city was divided into parties. French, English, Scottish, Irish, Protestants, and Catholics were the ones he enumerated. The only thing they agreed upon, according to Bernstein, was hatred of the Jews. In 1910, when tensions between French and English Canadians were again heating up over a number of issues, and both groups were flexing their nationalist muscles, Montreal's Yiddish paper, the Canada Rodler, commented that a lot of people think that in Montreal there will be a war between the Protestants and the Catholics. If there is, the paper predicted, the Jews will be the first to suffer from both sides. Well, the upside of outsiderness was that Jews turned inward and developed a vibrant communal life of their own. The intermarriage rate was for a long time infinitesimal. The Aliyah rate to this day has generally been about double that of the U.S. Traditional Judaism held on better in Canada than in most places, certainly than in the U.S., where an Americanized, less separatist Judaism emerged, more in line with American Jews' ability to join the American mainstream, until the mid-1950s reformed synagogues in all of Canada. And Zionism, as noted, has been hugely popular. In fact, unlike the US and Europe, there has been almost no anti-Zionism in Canada, except among some Jews on the communist fringe in the 1930s and the Hasidic fringe today. Among mainstream Jews, Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath of Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto spoke out forcefully against the concept of a Jewish state in the 1930s and early 1940s, but Eisendrath was an American anyway, and he was eventually sent on his way back home. To balance him, there was Montreal's longtime Reform rabbi, Harry J. Stern, a distant cousin of mine. The J was said to stand for Jesus, reflecting the rabbi's charismatic preaching and his interfaith work. Stern was at the other end of the Zionist spectrum from Eisendrath, a fan of Jabotinsky with decidedly revisionist leanings. So if Jews were neither British nor French, and neither Catholic nor Protestant in binational, bi-religious Canada, as the country was de facto from 1759 and de jure from 1867, they were intensely Jewish. Mimar yatsa matok, as the good book has it, the bitterness produced something sweet. Now, if you're a fan of Jewish communal life or a Jewish survivalist, it was not a bad deal. In the interwar years, shlichim from Eretz Yisrael loved to visit Canada. They couldn't collect a lot of money because Canadian Jews were still mostly not well-off immigrants. But they were received warmly by people who understood why the Zionist enterprise was crucial for the Jewish people. And the shlichim from Katzenelson and Arlozorov to Shmaryahu Levin and Menachem Lusishkin, although not Jabotinsky, interestingly, felt there was a great difference between Canadian Jews and Jewish Americans. They reported home positively about Canada and negatively about the U.S. in words not so much unlike those of A.B. Yehoshua in Washington recently. Of course, if you were a Jew who wanted to be a teacher, or studying medicine and in need of a hospital in which to intern, it wasn't so great. And if you were a kid who got harassed and maybe thrashed by Gentile ruffians on the way to and from school, it also didn't seem so great. The Globe and Mail a couple of months ago, Max Layton, the son of the poet Irving Layton, who died recently, wrote a little memoir of his father. And he tells, I think his mother was not Jewish, as I remember, and one day he was playing outside with a bunch of kids from the neighborhood, and he came running upstairs to his father, and he said, well, Mikey is Irish, and Jean-Pierre is French, and someone else was something else. He said, what am I? And his father said, you have to know that you are Jewish, and that is the most wonderful thing possible. You come from a line of thousands of years of rabbis and intellectuals and writers, probably said poets like me, and just that you have everything to be proud of. And Max says that he ran downstairs full of enthusiasm, and he gave the good news to his friends, who promptly beat him up. And on a more serious note, if you happen to be a refugee from Nazi Europe, hoping to save his family by emigrating to Canada, the country did not look good at all. For Canada accepted fewer Jews from Nazi Europe per capita than any other country in the Western world. For the individual Jew, opportunity was often limited in Canada, and prejudice was sometimes unlimited. But that was the price paid for community vitality. In the 1960s, the winds of change were blowing in Canada, perhaps even before. In 1938, John Murray Gibbon published a book about the peoples of Canada, which he called The Canadian Mosaic. Murray's claim was that Canada was not a melting pot like the United States, nor even a tight little duality of peoples, but rather a social mosaic that nurtured the diversity of each ethnic tile. Gibbon's depiction of Canada, however, was more wishful thinking at that point in time than it was reality literature. and it should be seen, in part at least, as a book of its time, namely the run-up to World War II, when unity, or at least lip service to unity, was increasingly important. By the 1960s, however, the mosaic notion of Canadian society really was taking hold. In the immediate post-war years, it was easier for a Ukrainian veteran of the Waffen-SS to immigrate to Canada than it was for a Jewish veteran of the death camps. But soon immigration policy began to shift, becoming less and less restrictive, and immigrants were far less pressured than